My name is Craig Picken. I'm an executive recruiter. More than a decade ago, I started my practice for one purpose: to use my experience as a former military aviator, business jet sales executive, and P&L leader to help aviation and aerospace companies and their executives be fast, adaptable, and strategic. I do these podcasts to inspire and inform, but more importantly, they are a focused platform to help business leaders grow. Welcome to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. Hey, welcome back to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to have Nick Pastushan on with me. Nick is CEO. He's a well-known voice in aircraft leasing and finance. He's been around the industry for a long time. Currently, the CEO of Warbird Capital, where he's doing a lot of advisory work with private equity and some restructuring firms. He also works in the private equity environment and does some investment in some smaller companies in the aviation aerospace arena. He's the former chief investment officer at CIT, where he helped to steer more than $20 billion in aviation assets. And he got his start in the industry back in the early 90s with GE Capital. So Nick, thanks for coming on with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So obviously, COVID has thrown a big wrench into the commercial aircraft arena. Where do we go from here? The whole industry needs the airlines to start flying again. Finance and leasing are going to play a big part in that. What are the challenges with the leasing companies, and where are the opportunities down the road? Where do we start?
Well, I guess we probably have to start from the very big picture, because leasing is sort of a whole ecosystem unto itself that supports the financing of the OEM builds and all that, which is an ecosystem unto itself. And each of these little food chains are all based on the airlines themselves. If you want to use that ecosystem analogy, the best way to think about it is, in a traditional ecosystem of, plants and animals, the sun is the energy source. The plants turn that solar energy into chemical energy, and then animals of all kinds eat the plants and eat other animals, and all these interconnected food webs.
Right.
The aviation example for that is that the sun, or our energy source here, is travel demand. People want to go places. That's the whole reason the industry exists. Airlines are the ones who turn that demand into realized travel, and therefore dollars. Those dollars flow out of the airlines to employees, to aircraft manufacturers for purchases, to leasing companies or the banks who finance some of that equipment, to the MRO community. All the various parts of aviation that all need to be present for the ecosystem to work are all dependent on that revenue source of turning travel demand into dollars. So what we've had here with COVID is like the asteroid that hit the Earth that wiped out the dinosaurs. So it blocked out the sun, which is our travel demand.
Yep.
So without that travel demand, and with the plants, which is our airlines, dying from lack of energy or dollars from customers, all the various parts of the ecosystem are at risk of collapsing also. So when you think about it, in that sort of big picture way, any particular part of it, whether it be leasing or OEM or MRO, are all in it together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about, when do people start to travel again? When are they comfortable enough to travel and not be worried about social distancing? And how do you queue up in a security line and a check-in line and all these other things that we know is part of the airport experience? Right now, what we have is just fundamentally incompatible with that. So we have a risk of the entire ecosystem collapsing. I try not to be too dramatic about it, but this could be a mass extinction event like it was to the dinosaurs. So where do we go from here? Well, we need the recovery to happen. And, if a whole bunch of bankruptcies, the mass extinction thing happens, well, there will be new money, and there will be new startups, and there will be new companies, and aviation will be here, and there will be travel. It just may look very different in a couple of years as new companies are starting from the ashes, just because it's really hard to bridge from where we are now to the point of recovery if we're not going to have a vaccine or something else that restores consumer confidence quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. Look, I was looking at, I'm one of these, maybe I'm just an overly optimistic person, but I was looking at Memorial Day and all the crowds at the beaches and the rivers. And my sense is that people do want to get back on airplanes. They're probably not as scared. But the question is, governments, when do states and countries reopen their borders and allow people to actually travel? And I think that's the wild card, right now.
Yeah, so certainly international travel is more impacted, and that will take longer to come back. Therefore, the wide bodies will come back later. So, in a perfect scenario, if all travel was opened, even on a domestic basis in the U.S. or other large countries that have domestic travel, how many people would actually show up? Is it half of what it used to be? Is it 3/4? And are airlines even viable at those kind of traffic levels? So break-even load factors generally are around 75%.
Yep.
The airlines have not gone through restructurings to shrink all their fixed costs that was the network of the pre-COVID size. So while you can say, yeah, there's all these green shoots that there's some capacities coming back, and if we have this huge recovery being down 95% and coming up to being only down 50, is that sustainable? Well, no. The post 9/11 downturn had traffic for the year down like 12% domestically, and it took a couple years to come back from there. This
Right.
is far, far worse. So, that basically triggered bankruptcies of almost all the U.S. carriers, ex-American. So we can see the green shoots, but we're still a long ways away from a sustainable system in terms of P&L.
Yeah. So Doug Parker came out a couple of days ago and said, bankruptcy is not an option. United is trudging along and pushing forward. Same thing. I think everybody agrees that they're probably the two carriers that may be in the most precarious positions. You've got Southwest out there, which had the best balance sheet of them all. Is there some winners and losers in this thing, or what do can the airlines get through without a bankruptcy? I mean, they're all living on government money now, and everybody's saying September 30th is kind of the day when we'll know.
Yeah, the government dollars were a desperately needed lifeline, and the way it was at least proposed, or maybe this is the lobbying approach, was, look, if we were to fail immediately, all these people are going to be unemployment anyway. So if you can give us the money that would be similar to the unemployment amounts from now till the fall, it's really not as much of a bailout of the shareholders or the creditors, it's the workers. And it's much easier politically for people to get around helping workers than bailing out shareholders or executives. That's just politics. So that's what it was designed for. And if there was a somewhat V-shaped recovery, which is that by the fall traffic is coming back to some sort of a normal level, or maybe lower than it had been, but still pretty good, it would have worked just fine. It would have still caused losses for the airlines, because the bailouts, if those are really only covering their personnel costs, they're still got cash burn on the rest of their operation, whether they're not operating or operating below even just the cost of the fuel of the planes flying when you're flying nearly empty.
Yep.
So there'd still be losses. So the question is, will there be demand at 80 or 90% of the pre-COVID levels by the fall? Yeah, I think now the answer to that is almost certainly no. It might have been sort of hopeful at the beginning that, this virus thing will be contained, or we'll get rid of it pretty quickly. That hasn't happened. So I think there's going to be big job cuts as soon as that expires, and then you'll have the scramble of companies trying to figure out how to survive, how much they have to downsize. Every CEO will downplay the possibility of bankruptcy and keep fighting and trying to save the company. It's their job. Mm-hmm. So I'm not surprised at all to hear those comments. And if you think about what happened after 9/11, which really kind of ran into SARS and then Gulf War II in terms of traffic disrupting events,
Yep.
So you had a year's worth of a string of events. But the main portion of the bankruptcies did not occur until a couple of years later. So
Right.
it takes a long time, even when a company is losing money, until they really run out of all the options. They pull every lever they can to try to raise additional money, get additional debt, restructure things out of court. They'll do anything possible to avoid going into a bankruptcy because that's sort of the worst case scenario from a company. So I'm not at all surprised about those comments. And the management teams are going to do everything they can to keep the companies afloat. Now, I know, or I guess no one can know anything, but I am very confident that this airline industry domestically and around the world will still be here in a couple of years. Will some of the names change? Will some of the debt become equity? And will some of them have gone through restructuring? Unfortunately, yes. Will there be a lot less employment? Unfortunately, yes. But will that demand still be there, that fundamental need of travel? And will somebody be there to service it? Absolutely. So the long-term prospects for the industry, our old growth rates might be a thing of the past, but it will be there. It will be a major portion of the economy again, but we've got a lot of pain to go through to get from A to B.
So how do we get through? I mean, you're advising, you're working with companies now and advising them on, restructuring. What do we as an industry or individual companies, what do we need to focus on to restructure through this? I mean, obviously cash is king. What equipment gets us to the other side? What's the starting point, do you think?
Well, that's where it gets so challenging, because if we knew that the demand level and activity with airlines would be at 80% of pre-COVID in the spring of 2021 or something like this, any kind of fixed number, you can design a plan that lets you get that. How long of a bridge do you need to build is the question. So therefore, how much capital do you need to raise? How much do you have to downsize to be able to survive to get there? Right now, we don't know yet. So these initial restructurings that are starting to happen, we don't know what's going to happen with them. Some of them may turn into liquidations. So at this point, there's still so much uncertainty. It's hard to make a plan and a capital structure that can survive it. What I've been recommending in a lot of cases, especially to creditors, is the worst thing you can do in the next year as a creditor is to put a company into a liquidation. Let's say, whether it be an airline or, a pooled investment vehicle that owns a bunch of airplanes or something like that, selling the assets now when there's literally no demand out there, with 60% plus of the world fleet parked, trying to sell airplanes right now would be the worst thing you can possibly do. You're better off just putting it into hibernation. So, I know it's a painful thing. You're going to have a lot of losses, but the recovery will be a lot better. Just putting things into deep storage, not liquidating it, and waiting. You might be waiting 2 or 3 years, but hibernation is going to be better than liquidation. And the same thing applies to anybody on the manufacturing side. Airlines don't want airplanes right now. They don't need airplanes. So having the production lines running may be good for the OEM primes because they have nothing else. That's what they do. But it's going to be hard for them to get delivered because the customers don't want them. It's going to be hard to finance them. Most of their customers are on the verge of bankruptcy if they're alive. So you're pushing a rope. So again, I would recommend a strategy of hibernation. Maintain the capability, the industrial manufacturing and the know-how, the certifications, but go into a deep hibernation. That's a really hard medicine for people to understand when they say, oh, my job is to build airplanes or to build parts, and I've got this order book. Yeah, you've got an order book, but it may not be worth the paper it's written on if all your customers are going through bankruptcies.
Yeah, well, the Boeing, you look at Boeing and Airbus, their order books were 5,000 airplanes deep on the narrow bodies, and 18 months ago you could take that to the stock market and sell it. Today you realize it's it's vapor. It's really not 5,000 airplanes. It's 20 a month or whatever Boeing's willing to build and what they think they can, what they think they can sell, which is very little. But what about, you hear about AirCap now, debt for equity in Norwegian.
Yeah.
Is this going to be a more common phenomena where the leasing companies now have to, basically become airlines?
Well, they're not becoming airlines, but they are going to have to swap some of the money that is owed to them for something else. You can take a total write-off if they liquidate, or you can take some equity in exchange for that and keep your customer alive, and hopefully then you have someone to be able to provide services to in the form of airplanes in the future. So keeping a customer alive is certainly better than not having them there. So much like the conventional wisdom on the OEM side, which is that the order book is this great fortress, and you can always shift things around because if one customer doesn't want it, another one does. The same thing applies to leasing companies. The conventional wisdom and traditional way of dealing with airline problems from the inception of leasing was that this is a global market and you have mobile equipment such that if there's a problem in one region or one airline and they fail and they give you the equipment back, you always have somewhere else to put it. COVID and the mass extinction event of the comet hitting the Earth that I talked about in the beginning changed all that. There's now correlation. Every airline is dealing with excess airplanes. So if you take airplanes back from someone who defaults or liquidates, you really don't have any customers to take them. That's never happened before in the history of leasing. Even in the darkest days post 9/11 or in the financial crisis period, if you got some airplanes back, there might be some downtime, but you weren't thinking about putting a very young, capable, great airplane on the ground for 2 years before you'd be able to have a customer. That's a complete game changer. So when you think about that of the lessor P&L and cash position, GCAS reported the other day that 85% of their customers have asked for deferrals. Some have been granted, some of them not. Some have been full repossessions. We've heard similar numbers from some of the other major lessors. So with that kind of level of deferral action going on, 3 months worth of getting no rents, those 3 months are going to come up and those airlines are still going to not be healthy because it wasn't a V-shaped recovery. So those deferrals are going to extend. The question is how many of those turn into defaults? How many of them turn into full-blown restructurings? How many of those end up like the Norwegian model where you have to accept as the lessor or the creditor a deal that you would never even consider because you don't have a credible alternative. If you were to take the airplanes back, you don't have anything to do with them. If you leave them there and take the debt for equity swap, you have the airline paying the insurance and the storage and doing the maintenance program while the airplanes are stored. If they give them back to you, you have to pay for that. So it's the best of, frying pan or fire kind of things. Like, well, they're both terrible, but, you take the frying pan.
It almost takes a lot of these assets and makes them negative equity. It's like, hey, I'll pay you to take this. You think about, Delta parking their 777s, their 7576s, their MD-80 series aircraft. Everything that's old is now in the boneyard, will probably never come back.
Yes, certainly the types that are being eliminated entirely from a fleet, very few of those will come back. I mean, if you've got parts or engines or whole things, of the Delta MD-80 fleet, I mean, that was one of the last ones operating. Those, it's not even worth scrap metal now. It's literally zero.
It's literally,
So when you think about it that way, to an investor, if you own an airplane and you don't have a lessee anymore, you could argue that it's worthless because you have to pay to insure it, to store it, to do maintenance. And to get it back on lease, you might have to put a new interior in it or whatever. When you do it net present value, those cash flows, on an older airplane, it's just, there's nothing to do. On a younger airplane, there's still positive value there, but it's really based on the option value of that thing getting back into the fleet in the future. because it was about a month ago, we saw a weird situation where oil, which is a valuable commodity, was actually trading at a negative value because the storage location at the physical delivery site for the futures was full. So it is weird that you could have a valuable asset that has a lot of capability that just has no demand right now. Does it have a negative value? No. I mean, it has a long-term value still because there's the option of getting it back in service. It is a capable asset. But all the conventional wisdom about values and retention of values, and there's always buyers, that's also changed. It's really hard to overstate the impact of COVID on all parts of this market. So you could have a very capable airplane, a brand new one, or let's say, a year old or something like that, but a new technology airplane, whether it be a 787 or an A350 on the wide body side, or an A321neo, which is sort of the cream of the crop in narrow bodies, a MAX, assuming all the certification issues were taken care of and it's back in the air, doesn't really matter. But the value of those things pre-COVID, and then if you just plug into that same model, 2 or 3 years of downtime and paying those expenses, and then a low lease for the initial lease, and then everything after that, 5, 7 years out into the future is back to the same assumptions it would have been pre-COVID.
Yep.
The difference in that math on a net present value basis is over 30%. So that's, if I was a distressed investor looking to buy an airplane, whether it be a whitetail or something coming out of default or something like that, I look at that math and say, okay, this is the cash flows I can get over the next 20 years for this asset. It looks nothing like the pre-COVID numbers. And that's even using the same discount rate. Now, you would imagine that a distressed investor coming in at this point in time is going to be somebody that needs a much higher return because they're taking much higher risk than previously. So when you put in a higher discount rate, the math gets even worse. So from that basis, the loss given default to lessors and the value which people might be able to sell aircraft that are naked, not with a lease right now, are very, very different than they used to be. So current market value today is distressed value because any sale is by definition distressed.
Yeah, we saw it. My background was more business aviation, and we saw it during the financial crisis in 2008 to 10, or really 2009 through 11. Talking to a broker, you say, "What's the value of this G550?" And he goes, "I don't. It's the value of it is what the next guy is willing to pay for it."
Yeah, the first guy through the door. Anybody who's willing to buy it, they're going to throw out a number. So when there really is no market, there's no Bidask Spread even to quote. It's really hard, and I have a lot of sympathy for the ISTAT appraisers that are trying to be data based in their updates to customers about what values of airplanes are. There are a few transactions happening now, some of which were ones that were already in the queue before, so they may not be reflective of current situation. I'm not aware of much activity out there that meets the ISTAT definition of a single unit sale without a lease of an equally motivated buyer and seller that you could use as a good data point. I just don't think those exist yet. So they've tried to use proxies of values from the post 9/11 period to try to guesstimate. They know there's been a shift. They try to report a shift, but they don't know how much yet.
Yep.
And it might be a year or two before we see enough transactions to really get an idea. And most of these initial transactions are going to be coming out of a bankruptcy or something else like that, which would not qualify as being a equally motivated buyer and seller by any means.
Yep. So let's take it a different road. Boeing is now restarting the MAX production line. And my guess is whatever rolls off is now going to be a whitetail. So does it go into storage, and does somebody, does some investor or investment group or somebody come along at some point when that airplane gets recertified and able to fly? Do they just throw a number at Boeing and say, "We'll take it off your hands," and eventually, sit on it and wait for the market to turn? Or, Airbus, the same thing on their narrow bodies. The A220s are now, restarting as well. The OEMs have got to be, biting their fingernails going, what the heck do we do here?
Yeah, so that's complicated because realistically, the only time you see a true whitetail is if at the time they start building it, they don't have a customer for it. So anybody who's visited one of the production lines sees that even while the airplane is in its green state without paint, the rudder is painted because it's very important to have the weight and balance of that super precise. So when it's assembled, the tail or the rudder of the tail is already in the customer livery. So if it's white, that means there isn't a customer. And that's actually very rare. Given all the airplanes in the backlog today, everything they've been building has a customer order associated with it. And everything when they start production will probably have one of those original customer orders associated with it. So they're not technically whitetails. But the question will be, is that customer actually going to take it? Have they already deferred it? Have they already canceled it? Are they going to show up at the delivery center or not? So they may have a whole bunch of airplanes that have the tail painted, but also more importantly, the whole interior and the avionics are customized to that customer's spec. If they don't show up and take delivery, you now have an airplane that's built to one specific spec. If you're ultimately going to use it to a different airline, maybe one of the different business model and different seat configuration, you got to rip all that interior out and try to put in another one at tremendous expense after the production has been done.
That's another $5-6 million right there.
Yeah. So the logistical issues of the OEMs to juggle this order book and see who's still willing to take the airplanes. And okay, well, do I have the airplane that's in that spec for them or not? You might have 400 Air Maxes sitting there parked, but that's not the one that the customer that's willing to take delivery has specified as far as their exact spec. So even though you have 400 of them sitting there, those were earmarked and designed and built to the different customer spec.
So the bottom line is it's going to be chaos to sort all this out for another 2 years, 3 years, with a couple hundred airplanes on the ground, a couple hundred brand new Maxes on the ground, on top of what everybody's got parked. He who can figure it all out is king, I guess, is the answer, and it's a very complex equation.
Even before COVID, the whole bringing the Max back into service and getting all those assembled but undelivered airplanes actually out in customers' hands was a tremendous logistical challenge. When you even think about that in the simulator training that's now going to be part of that, getting the pilots ready for it, let alone just the delivery process. They were looking at an extended period of time to get all those undelivered airplanes out while the demand was still fully strong pre-COVID. Now it's going to be much, much more difficult.
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit older airplane now. You've got, a lot of 737 new gens, A320, midlife A320s. They're probably going to come out of the desert and they're going to be the ones that the airlines rebuild with. But I suspect that MRO dollars are going to be, at a premium. Any engine that's coming due for a major event will probably be swapped out for green time. You've got guys like Charlie Willis out there, Willis Lease, ACS, Air Capital Solutions, ELF, etc. Are they in a good spot to move forward? Is anybody with a green time engine going to see a lot of upside, or is that going to be equally as challenged, do you think?
No, green time will be the name of the game. And if you're an airline and you've got a fleet that's grounded and you brought it back and maybe half of your airplanes are flying, those other half that aren't flying is going to be the first place you're going to go for any part you need or any engine. So even before you go out to an engine lessor or anybody else or the market looking for green time, you're going to cannibalize your own. And then once you get through that level, then it's a decision of, do you overhaul one of your own engines or just lease one in because you're still so cash constrained. So the MRO outlook in terms of parts and services is one of the worst in the whole sector, because to have this level of aircraft not operating, the cannibalization opportunities, the part out opportunities of these airplanes that's just going to provide a wave of used serviceable material. Aftermarket parts and MRO are going to be some of the last things to come back. Now, there are some inefficiencies in the market. So when you have an airline that goes bankrupt, that might have a whole fleet of aircraft and engines, including spares, those engines at that green time may not immediately come to market because it's tied up in all kinds of bankruptcy proceedings. So somebody who needs an engine, a smaller airline that doesn't have a huge fleet to cannibalize, going to an engine lessor to get an engine for green time may be their best option, even if there's hundreds of other engines theoretically out there, but they're all tied up in some kind of a bankruptcy or insolvency.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I never thought about that. It's and those things are never quick either. Those processes never go fast.
Correct.
Which definitely brings more dynamics. How do the airlines rebuild? Do they come back as low-cost carriers and just trying to sell seats to get demand regenerated? Or do they come back as, higher price because the demand is limited?
Well, if you think it from a unit economic standpoint, if you're going to fill every seat and have high utilization, that low-cost model works. In a low-demand environment, filling all of your seats and having high aircraft utilization, 11 hours a day or something like that, it seems like a long putt. So I would think that higher cost travel is more likely what we're going to see if airlines are trying to, actually break even. You may see situations where, we're going to lose less money by discounting the fares and trying to fill the plane. We're going to lose money anyway, but so let's not even try to recover our cost. Let's just, get the maximum dollars we can. Hard to tell how airlines and fleet planners will do that in a very dynamic demand environment. Once we reopen, we don't know how much demand is going to come back, how fast. So balancing the schedules versus the demand and the pricing strategy is going to be a lot of guesswork. I mean, there's no precedent for this. There's no model that's going to be great. You're going to have to do trial and error. So I'm not sure. We will see. After a lot of bankruptcies, if there's a lot of voids in the market of countries or regions that are underserved, you could see new airlines starting up to fill that void. That may be different business models than what you saw there before. As far as their aircraft selection, the interesting thing is that the capital cost on the fleet that is already delivered becomes a variable cost. I mean, normally you think of that as fixed. Yeah, I paid $40 million for this airplane, blah, blah, blah. Here's what it's worth. If I went to go get one from somebody else, it's going to cost the same thing. Now, after all these defaults, lessors have all these airplanes they're desperate to get some customer for. A 10-year-old A320ceo or 737-800, you might be able to get exceptionally cheap. And there's a large number of pilots and spares and things like that. So even if you were to look at all these brand new Maxes that Boeing will be offering, also probably with very attractive terms, the capital cost differential between those two offsets, the fuel burn differential by far. So building a business model on 10-year-old airplanes may be far better than brand new. And we will have to wait and see. But if I had to pick winners among fleet types of what's going to stay operating, I would pick the airplanes that have a lot of capability and they're going to be really, really cheap to lease or buy. And that's going to be midlife airplanes, low capital cost.
Yeah, you probably get a good 737 for new gen 700 800 for $10 million or whatever, a little bit more than, maybe slightly more than what's, the value of the engines.
Yeah.
And you're off to the races. I mean, you see some, you've got, David Neilman out there. He's looking to, start something, start a new airline with, Moxie or whatever it's called now. And a couple other people out there, raising capital to start their airlines. And the question is do they become a better bet, starting from scratch than some of the legacy carriers trying to start over again?
the time when an airline has its lowest unit costs is, when it first starts up. I guess once it gets to full operating efficiency, but all their costs are, you haven't had all the cost inflation that you have of being in business for a long time and have employees for a long time. So yes, I think startups, assuming there's a big void to fill from a lot of bankruptcies, startups will be there and will do well. So Moxie and some of the other ones that were already really close to starting when this hit, are they going to go back to the drawing board and do a slightly different business plan? Maybe they start with used equipment, not new. That argument we talked about before, even though, the A220 is a great airplane for the certain size routes and things like that. If you can pick up 737-700s or A319s, A320s for next to nothing, you can do that same mission actually cheaper. It's not the long-term plan, because then you're going to have to eventually transition the fleet once those airplanes get older. But if you can pick them up for next to nothing, why not?
Yeah, no, that's kind of what, hey, look, it's price solves all problems, as one friend of mine taught me many years ago. And, if something is cheap enough, there's a lot of value in it. And, an A319 at, 10, 12 million bucks compared to an A220 at, nearly 30. That's a big delta in there.
Exactly. So, and even that, $10 million price, we used to think about that as being the scrap value or the part out value. With so much used serviceable material out there, who knows what a part out value actually is right now, because it's going to take a much longer time for those parts to be absorbed. Most of it's really in engines anyway. So it's really all about green time. But, even that number, what your part out value is might be down dramatically versus what you thought. So you think of all these companies that have been doing the used aircraft to part out business, a lot of which are funded by ABS structures, asset-backed securitizations.
Yep.
Those are in really bad shape. So,
I was just getting ready to say, anybody who's parted out, bought an airplane for part out or an engine for part out in the last 12, 18 months has probably got a big headache right now.
Yes. I mean, anybody who owns any kind of aircraft risk has got a problem, but the older the airplane, the less chance of recovery, just because you have less time to work with, and your part out value is going to be down. And that, if that's what you were relying on, was a couple of years of lease and a part out, well, instead of getting a couple of years lease, you now have a couple of years of storage, and so you lost all that revenue, and then your part out numbers are a lot lower too. So a lot of people are going to be left holding the bag here. So bond investors and ABS are going to be uniquely exposed. Amongst the lessors, those that have used commercial secured debt bank funding are going to run into problems with their banks very quickly. The creditors are going to need to get organized and see what they can do there, but they're likely going to become the owners of those. Some of the big lessors that have relied a lot on unsecured debt, they can go out and borrow secured debt, and changing their unsecured into subordinated debt. That's not a really good option, but at least those companies have some financial flexibility. But once they start reporting numbers in the second quarter numbers and then the third quarter numbers, we'll see the full impact of all these deferrals and how much their revenue is hit. Yep. I think the market is going to hate those numbers when they see them.
Yeah, I see the leasing companies, their stock prices keep going up, and eventually these guys got to report their numbers, and they're not going to be pretty. And I don't know what happens to that, to those numbers in 6 months or a year. But so
I think the equity markets, I think, are a little confused about that. They're trading up with the rest of the market on some general hope about things coming back, or a virus hope or things like that. But on the fundamentals, there's no reason why they should be getting better. The airline defaults are just piling up. So more and more pressure on the leasing companies there. Nordic Aviation Capital had their investment grade rating on the day that they went to their bondholders to ask for restructuring. So the rating agencies are not moving as fast as you would like. But again, they're relying on reported data, much like the appraisers. They're waiting for data. I guess, you and I as observers, speculators, consultants, et cetera, have the ability to jump right to conclusion. Those other parties that are waiting to see the results are going to, by definition, going to be behind the curve.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, look, for the long term, just assume, let's assume best case, the industry starts to rebuild itself, 3Q 2021, and then, numbers come back to, the passenger numbers come back to a reasonable level, 70, 80% load factors or, whatever. Are their memories going to be long on this? Is this going to, is the industry going to be capital constrained from an investment basis moving forward until the memory becomes a little bit diluted?
Probably not. The debt might be harder to come by because the banks that are going to get torched in this are going to have longer memories. There's always other investors out there. If there's a good idea and somebody comes out with a credible business plan and there's an opportunity to be addressed, money will find its way to that. There's always people that are going to be eager to try to grab an opportunity. So I believe there will be money there. In a lot of cases, you're either going to be bringing something up from the ashes that might have liquidated, or maybe if there's something in hibernation, you need to recapitalize it to get it going again. The money will be there. So when the demand is there and there's a credible business case, I am confident that the capital markets and capitalism will support this, and people will see the opportunity, knowing that aviation in the long term is a great business with a fundamental inherent resiliency of demand that has been tested here like it's never been tested before. But the reason why traffic continuously had grown at more than 2x GDP for decades is making travel cheaper, an expanding middle class around the world, and a fundamental desire to go see new places, to have face-to-face meetings, et cetera. That's not going to go away.
Right.
You got to put on the real long-term view to get there, but it's going to be there.
I feel the same way. I think you and I are both kind of aligned. Short term, it's going to be ugly. It's a dark storm that we're going through now. Long term, we'll all be okay. But as an industry, we'll be okay. But it's going to take a little while to get there. When do you think it starts to, crystal ball? You think we're a year out? You think it's 2022, 2023? How long do you think it takes for the financial markets to unsort, what they've gotten into?
That's such a scenario-based analysis on, do we have a vaccine? Are there mutations? It's so virus-specific scenario of trying to come up with something that's credible, because the problem we have here is fear.
Yep.
If we remove the fear, we don't have a problem anymore. We might have some changed behaviors of people doing many more business meetings on Zoom or Teams or any of these other technologies. However, I think it's going to come back to something close to what we saw previously. Our old 5% growth rate might be out the window because green pressures plus more video conferencing and other things may make that growth rate not happen. But the fundamental demand, we'll get back to a good level where we can have a sustainable industry. It may not be quite as big as it was previously. And then, a growth rate from there, maybe not as high of a growth rate, but a growth rate again in a couple of years. But the scenarios are all about, when is the fear removed? And frankly, I have no idea. And I don't even think the experts that are working on the vaccines have any idea.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. And you're right. It is a very people dependent. The big question is, once again, when do governments start to open their borders? When do people stop having fear?
Yeah.
When does the media, when does the hype, start to dissolve and people get back into their normal lives? So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Our full recovery means everybody, the fear is gone entirely as if it never happened. And that's going to be, a long time away. So if everything opens up, maybe half the people say, you know what, I just want to get back to my life. I'm, under 50 and I don't really think I'm at high risk. I've got to just start doing things. I want to go on vacation. I want to do things. There's going to be some people that are going to be the early adopters, much like when a new technology comes out, right? When we open up the floodgates, the early adopters will be out there, but maybe that's only 30% of what it used to be. To get back to 100%, we need to get everybody. And that's, to get to sustainable load factors or break-even load factors, we need more than the early adopters. We need almost everybody to be back. We need cruise ships operating, theme parks open, all the destinations that is causing people to travel. It's not just going to visit grandma or, doing a business meeting. It's all the other things, the international travel. So it's going to be phases, and it's going to be hard to right size the industry to each phase, because each phase may not last that long. And we might have 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Hard to guess, but to say it's going to be dynamic, I guess, is probably the best prediction.
Yeah, I
agree.
agree.
Actually have to make a prediction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's the one thing people, it's easy to shut things down quickly. It's harder to ramp them back up again. And once you turn off a factory and shut off your suppliers, it's easy to do that. But to get everybody back is a month or year long or months long or years long process. So I guess we'll just have to be patient. Hey, thanks for coming on today, Nick. I love the discussion. Appreciate you coming on and talking about this.
Great. Yes, I enjoyed it too. And look forward to having future conversations.
What's next for you?
So my focus in the near term is on the recapitalization and restructuring of the industry. So when I saw what had happened with COVID and all the distress, I really repositioned Warbird Capital from being more of just an investment firm doing loans and private equity to advisory work. So I've teamed up with a boutique restructuring firm called Conway McKenzie, and that allows Warbird and other groups that I'm connected to bring the capabilities of a large scale, well, not large scale, but it's a boutique size, but a fully capable restructuring firm to this aviation business. There weren't a lot of aviation restructuring people because we haven't had a lot of restructuring in aviation. Mm-hmm. The post-financial crisis downturn, if you will, was a little blip in the traffic growth, but on an OEM side, we grew through it. So there hasn't been much distress. There aren't a lot of people that have the real detailed aviation knowledge that are doing restructuring work. So frankly, that's the opportunity that I saw, is the ability to try to help be part of the solution, which is restructuring and recapitalization.
That's awesome. So you come back on in a couple months and industry update?
Yep, and it may take a couple quarters before we're making a lot of progress. So I may not have much of an update in a couple months, but I'll be happy to talk again.
I'll tell you, we'll bring you back in the fourth quarter. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right, Nick. Hey, thanks for coming on today. Greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the latest edition of the Aerospace Executive Podcast. You can reach out to me directly, Craig at NorthstarESG.com, or check us out at www.northstaresg.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, or on YouTube. Just do a search for Aerospace Executive Podcast. Thanks again. I'm Craig Pickett.